China's regulatory approach to AI governance. What is it and what's driving it? To discuss, I have on again Matt Sheehan, who I'm maybe taking the belt from none other than Chris Miller today on China Talk with his fourth or fifth appearance on the podcast. It's too many years in the hopper at this point. Excited to have Matt from Carnegie back on the show. The occasion is the release of the new Chinese AI governance regulations, which very conveniently came out just as the first part of his new series on reverse engineering Chinese AI governance released. And I thought it was an excellent paper. So here we are to talk about it. Matt, back to China Talk.
Thanks a lot for having me back. Honored and humbled to take the belt.
Let's start macro. What is driving China's approach to AI governance?
The core driver is concern over control of information. Like the three regulations that they've put out so far, if you kind of trace each of them to their root and to the core concern of the Chinese Communist Party, it's always control over information. In some cases, that's dissemination of information. In some cases, that's creation of content, creation of information. So, the first thing that it put out was the regulation on recommendation algorithms. That was very much driven because they didn't like the way that certain Chinese news apps or social media apps were using personalized recommendation to disseminate content. They liked the old days when, the People's Daily or CCTV or eventually websites were able to essentially rank what were the most important stories of the day, what are people going to see the most of. And when recommendation algorithms started personalizing that content for each person, they got nervous about that. So that drove recommendation algorithms. The next one was deep synthesis, which was really rooted in their concern over deep fakes. Pretty clear what the information concerns there are. And most recently, generative AI, which again kind of builds on the concern over deep fakes, but sort of transfer that to the realm of text rather than like images and audio. So that's really what like at the center of all these things. But as each of the regulations makes its way through China's intellectual environment, through its companies, and then through its bureaucracy, you see all these other concerns kind of tacked on. So concerns over protection of workers or concerns over monopolistic behaviors. And, some similar concerns to what we have in the West around sort of bias, discrimination, transparency, stuff like that.
Yeah. So the way you lay out in the piece is you have an overriding goal to shape the technology so it serves the CCP's agenda, particularly for information control. I would posit, and I think it's a fair characterization that you've made so far of what you've seen, is that if AI is going to be as big a deal as it has the potential to, and multiple percentage points of GDP growth coming from it and whatnot, the sort of Evan Feigenbaum China techno warrior dynamic of this is going to come much more to the fore. When she in the past has talked about AI and strategic emerging technologies, it's not generally on the sort of like information control stuff. And yes, that's something he's focused on and scared about. But I think there's like another piece of this, and the shoe maybe hasn't really dropped yet because the technology isn't matured or it isn't as deep enough into the economy. But my guess, and I'm curious for your take on this, Matt, is like, what would it take for the Chinese government to start to reframe AI as this like incredible opportunity and potentially society shaping thing? And, how do you think that the system, which to date has been mostly focused on, fighting the last war with, ByteDance and deepfakes and making sure people read the right news, how it may transition to trying to grapple with and harness the power of what is like a, industrial revolution scale technology.
Yeah, I think you're pointing at the right thing, and we're actually kind of right at that turning point right now, I think. And that basically happened in between the draft generative AI regulation and the final one, or what they call the interim regulation as of July. So the draft that came out in April was kind of their almost knee-jerk response to the rise of ChatGPT and the fear that these models are going to be spewing information that can't be controlled. They might be saying the wrong things. And they got very concerned about that. And the draft regulation was very harsh. It set like almost impossibly high standards for sort of political correctness of the model. All of the training data had to be true and accurate, and all of the outputs had to be true and accurate, which is just not possible with large language models today. And what you saw after that was a very sort of public debate within China about what to do with that draft regulation. You saw a lot of pushback from other parts of society and from Chinese tech policy academics around this, saying that the draft regulation was too harsh, it was going to stifle sort of the domestic industry, and it needed to be changed in a few specific ways. And when the final version came out in July, it basically swung to the other side of the spectrum. If you could think of it as there's always going to be this trade-off between sort of control and development, they went from very heavy on control in the draft to pretty heavy on development and much lighter on control in the final. And so you see this in specific changes where they don't say, the outputs have to be true and accurate. They say you have to, adopt effective measures to try to increase the accuracy of the outputs. So they way lowered the compliance requirements. They shrunk the scope of it a bunch to say, research and development is totally outside the scope of this. You can do a lot of stuff in industry. It's only when you make sort of public-facing generative AI that you have to abide by these rules. And other than those loosenings, you also saw the addition of a bunch of provisions that specifically say, hey, generative AI is important. We want to support its development. We want to push it in these ways. And it's kind of exemplified in some ways by the fact that the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission, became the second signatory on the final version. With all of China's algorithm and AI regulations, the draft has come out from the Cyberspace Administration of China, the CAC, which is always a very sort of content control focused organization. And then we put the final, they add some other organizations. Maybe it's Ministry of Science and Technology or Public Security. And the order of those ministries matters somewhat in terms of like the prioritization of inputs. And the generative AI final rules were the first time that the National Development and Reform Commission added itself to an AI regulation and put itself second, which I think signifies the shift that they're saying, hey, yes, control over information, very important, but both for sort of domestic economic reasons, for international competition reasons, we want to develop this industry and we don't want to smother it with sort of an extreme or unrealistic focus on controlling information.
Yeah. And so I think until these new draft regulations came out, the response was relatively predictable, right? It's like, of course, the CCP is going to be freaked out by this thing that can spit out all these, all these images of Winnie the Pooh and Chinese political leaders or whatever. Like, of course, they're going to be sort of like worried about this new variable in an information space that they've invested an incredible amount of money into. And I think there was this narrative in the West, which I was a party to. I wrote like a piece which I would maybe retract today. Talking about how this may be a sort of intellectual hurdle, which might be too difficult for Chinese regulators to sort of see past. That like there's more to this than just Renmin Herbao columnists having new competitors. And, there's a lot more that China, that sort of the Chinese government needs to grapple with in a more positivist way if they're going to try to maximize for all the other goals that Xi and the CCP more broadly have when it comes to sort of, economic development and international competition and so have you. So it's a fascinating turn that you point out of these new regulations, because like it seems we're entering the world in which there really is going to be this grand race and nothing is going to stop it. So I don't know, maybe thoughts on thoughts on that, Matt. Like, what should we take from them embracing this new worldview that you articulated in the new regulations?
I mean, I think the sort of initial reaction that you framed up was very like legitimate and grounded in in very good reasons. Like you rarely go wrong when you're betting on like the CCP sort of prioritizing control. That's especially under Xi. This has really been like the MO, and you could trace it back however far you want or in whichever field you want. But in tech specifically, since sort of the tech crackdown beginning in like 2020 or so, they've been very serious about this, and they haven't. They've always leaned in that direction. I think them switching their lean here has a few sort of signals built into it. I mean, one is what you're talking about, just like a broader realization of the power of AI. There's another economic component in that the Chinese economy, by all accounts, is in very bad shape, and they're getting increasingly worried about that. And like I think literally the day before they released the final generative AI regulations, they had another sort of big public embrace of the platform technology company.
I mean, it is weird, Matt, the sort of like toxic relationship dynamic that has developed between these private sector technology companies and the Chinese state. Because, 5 years ago, and even still to this day, there are lots of people who are in this broader ecosystem who have disappeared. And, you've had enormous chunks of the market capitalizations of a lot of these companies been sort of eviscerated by these regulators and these sort of ministers who are now trying to be buddy and say, hey, you should invest, and like, the future's bright for you in China. And what are the CEOs of these companies going to do? Of course they're going to say, yes, please, sir, may I have another? Even if maybe in their heart of hearts they're still a little scarred by what they've had to go through since I guess 2017.
Yeah, no, I agree. And like the companies basically don't have a choice. They obviously, some individual CEOs and founders have kind of voted with their feet in that even before they got, in trouble themselves, they sold their stake and they moved to Singapore and all that kind of stuff. But for, the main bulk of Alibaba's operations, it's just that, they make their money in mainland China primarily, and they will have to they will just have to sort of stick with it and deal with what the government is willing to give them. I think it's kind of interesting from the government's perspective in that, I would hesitate to say it's a sign of weakness or a show of sort of contrition in any way by the government, but it is a slight deviation from, I'd say, Xi's long-term MO of like, never compromise, never apologize, just do exactly what you want to do at all times. And I think it could be a sign of sort of how dire the economic fundamentals appear to be. It could be a bunch of different factors, but I think that fed into the re-embrace of the platform economy. I think it fled into the generative AI sort of final rules being much softer. That's from kind of an economic perspective. I think what you're alluding to of like, the great race, great game, we all understand the power of the technology. I think it's still something of an open question how the Chinese government thinks about AI as a potentially like transformative technology, or AGI, artificial general intelligence, all that stuff. It's still something where, while they've started to use the term artificial general intelligence, 通用人工智能, or maybe you could call that general purpose AI, they started to use that in official circles. In talking to people over there, you still get the sense that they are thinking of it primarily in a what can you do for me today kind of way. Like, what can more general AI systems do to feed into the economy? Whereas in the US, we obviously have our sort of contingent that's primarily in sort of the big AI labs that's very focused on, humongously civilizationally transformative AI. It's a little bit unclear how much of that has seeped into the Chinese political consciousness.
Yeah. I agree. I think the sort of, when you see folks in the AI safety community being like, we need to have a dialogue with China about, risks to humanity. It's like, they're not on that wavelength yet. And maybe they will. Well, I guess I'm curious, Matt, like what's your take on the potential for any sort of like China world's AI coordination, and what even like makes sense if we were I guess I can take this I'll take this in a lot of different directions.
Yeah. Maybe a couple different thoughts on that. One is how present is this line of thinking, or these strands of thinking within China? How present are, say, existential risk concerns or maybe catastrophic risk concerns within the Chinese AI community? They're definitely there. Some people share them. Some of the technical people, especially those who have been very sort of exposed to or embedded in the US tech ecosystem, are familiar with them. But it's nowhere near the sort of same prominence or centrality that it is within a lot of the US or, say, UK leading AI labs. In terms of the potential for coordination or collaboration or dialogue, it's in some ways I'm having to kind of update my thinking on this because things are moving so quickly, and the kind of the push for, say, international coordination on frontier AI models is kind of going very quickly, and there is a push to loop China into that by some, which I think I'm broadly supportive of. But I'd say my sort of baseline is the best way to ensure that China is doing things safely in AI is to have those ideas emerge and gain traction within China, not to sort of impose them through a new international regulatory body where we set all the rules and you just have to agree to these restrictions, but to try to communicate with, sort of maybe plant seeds or encourage dialogue that allows these ideas to foster and to grow within China's sort of policy environment or technical environment. I think there is still a lot of potential there. Like both China's regulators and China's tech community is both very, very interested and invested in what the rest of the world is doing, what the rest of the world is thinking on frontier AI. And I think that's a form of leverage that can be used to try to sort of get some good ideas in the mix there. No guarantees, but I think it might be our best bet.
Yeah. So my sort of happiest version of this, if what the world needs to survive is China doing, I don't know, good stuff around AI safety, is climate change. And, you had a arc over the past 15 years where China went from, the worst emitter on the planet to a country that, while yes, it signed up to COP and that was important, but like it signed up to COP because Xi Jinping convinced himself that climate change was really a problem, and that China had a real opportunity in investing in solutions to it. And the idea that like AI safety will be traded for other chits in the U.S.-China relationship strikes me as rather far-fetched. But if the sort of bottom up, like this is a world movement that like everyone agrees is a big deal, type of dynamic that happened for climate change in the 20th century can be replicated with artificial intelligence. That strikes me as a like slightly more plausible scenario than like a world government, Niels Bohr style, to sort of impose on two strategic adversaries like a global compute regulation framework or what have you.
Yeah, I think, and with climate change, you also saw like the evolution in China's sort of response to the rest of the world. I think when I was in Beijing in 2008, one of the first like headlines I remember reading was about how climate change, in a Chinese newspaper, was about how climate change was like a global conspiracy to hold China's development down. The rest of the world polluted, and now they're using this to hold us back. And you can imagine a very similar dynamic in thinking about AI development. And China was able to maybe organically and with a lot of communication and engagement from different actors, maybe not the U.S. federal government, but like California, Jerry Brown, different sort of NGOs and private sector actors. They did eventually kind of evolve their thinking on it, in a lot of ways out of self-interest, but a self-interest that also ends up serving the greater good.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is something that sort of AI safety folks don't understand, is like the conspiratorial mindset. And exactly what you said, Matt, like the idea that like we should like have full global transparency into compute governance, while at the same time you guys are doing export controls, is like the recipe for a Chinese viral like WeChat blogger to like take the EA community and turn it into like some like grand CIA funded conspiracy or what have you. But yeah, but like that doesn't serve anyone, and I think is not particularly helpful. But what I want to focus on, which I think is one of the more interesting parts of your paper and your broader research agenda, is sort of the untangling like how ideas around regulating artificial intelligence kind of like get into the broader Chinese political bloodstream. So maybe start off with like your how you like arrived at this research methodology and the mental model, and then maybe run us through one or two case studies of something like going from like the ether of discussion into actual policy documents.
Sure. Yeah. So the broader kind of framework that I'm putting it under, or the name of this series of reports I'm doing, is Reverse Engineering Chinese AI Governance. So the idea is look at a sort of final governance, final regulation, a final piece of governance, and identify the pieces in it that are potentially interesting or useful, and then work backwards and try to reverse engineer where did those ideas come from. Can we trace them backwards through state media, through think tank reports, through sort of public outcry or prominent issues that kind of bubbled up within the Chinese internet or the Chinese public discussion? And if we kind of pull enough of those reverse engineered strands together, maybe we have a working model of how China makes AI governance policy or AI regulatory policy. So that's the goal. I've had this idea for a while. I've always wanted to trace, trace a policy development from its absolute roots to when it gets crystallized in a piece of policy, then back down to how it's implemented, sort of the full life cycle of regulation. And with the AI governance initiatives, it's a bit exploratory and just trying to find unique pieces of the regulation that show promise in terms of working backwards, and then trace those as far as we can get them.
I just want to thank whoever your funder is for this work, for investing in this type of research, because it is so rare to sort of have the Venn diagram of someone like you who has the sort of bureaucratic Chinese background, has the language skills, and has a willingness to do God's work of sort of taking keyword searches and just reading a ton of stuff and trying to put the strands together. Because I think what comes out of that is a much more sophisticated understanding of China, not as this monolith, but of the government as this sort of permeable ecosystem where a lot more things than just Xi Jinping thought end up influencing it. And not to say that Xi Jinping thought isn't important, but I think in this work and by looking at Chinese governance through this lens, you really taught myself and lots of other players in this space about what people should be looking at if they want to understand what's going to happen on the horizon. So, anyways, sorry to interrupt you. With that, let's continue the story.
No, yeah, thanks a lot. I felt very lucky to have the sort of runway to invest in doing this work, because it was very labor intensive, very time intensive, a lot of just trawling through state media, trawling through sort of public outcry over events, and then how did those terms evolve over time. So maybe, it's probably best illustrated with a couple of specific things. And I'll use two that went into the first regulation, the recommendation algorithm regulation. So this final regulation, the draft came out in 2021. It was finalized, at the very end of 2021. And it sort of kicked off this run of 3 regulations targeting algorithms and AI. And I guess I'll trace 2 things backwards. I mean, one, just why recommendation algorithms? They're maybe the most common use of AI globally or on the internet, but they're also, it's a bit random. There are not many other governments or other organizations that think of recommendation algorithms as your first and foremost thing that you want to regulate. And so what I did is I took the term that they use, 算法推荐, so algorithmic recommendation, and I looked back through an archive of Chinese state media to find when did this first appear in state media and what were they talking about at the time. And there's a pretty clear moment when it kicks off, and it's in mid 2017. So shortly after the National AI Plan comes out. So People's Daily has 3 consecutive days of articles or of sort of editorials that are just laying into recommendation algorithms and all of the kind of ills that they bring to society and the information ecosystem. And in each of the articles, they are, I think, explicitly referring to Toutiao, Jinru Toutiao, which was the ByteDance news app that had been popular at that point in time. And they sort of, in the first editorial, they talk about how, this is leading to vulgarization of content and having all these, sort of societal ills. But as you kind of read, not just those editorials, but then the sort of think tank reports or the other articles that came out in state media around that time or afterwards, it's clear their concern is we're losing control over the ability to prioritize news and information content for people. We used to be able to say like, hey, every website, you have your top 5 articles of the day, and we're telling you what the top 5 articles of the day are. And when it's getting personalized, pushed out to people, it, they lose that control. And so that's kind of the spark, but that's all the way back in 2017. It's almost 4 full years before the final regulation comes out. And we basically, over the next 3 years, we watched this kind of get molded into, from a sort of a vague, like, dis-ease with recommendation algorithms into a set of technical standards and a set of policy positions. And this kind of plays out largely through this sort of government adjacent think tank and technical organization apparatus. So this is organizations like CAICT, Xintongyuan, which is like a very important and influential Chinese technical think tank, and the Chinese AI Industry Alliance. Groups like that would sort of first issue like position papers on what we think the problems are with recommendation algorithms and how they sort of lead to unsafe content. And then they started to do other things like develop sort of technical standards or industry working groups around like, how can we sort of mitigate these issues? Once that developed to a certain point, it basically made it into a central committee document. There was a December 2020 document from the central committee that was like a 5-year roadmap for rule of law, kind of saying like, what do we want to deal with? What issues do we want to deal with from a legal perspective over the next 5 years? And in that document, the 2 sort of AI related applications they called out were recommendation algorithms and deepfakes. Once it's kind of worked its way up to the central committee, then that's kind of empowers the CAC and other organizations to go back to work shaping the actual regulation. That came together over the next year and eventually a draft in 2021, the final at the end of the year. So that's kind of like, that's like the core concern of the regulation. That's where that's the motivator in a lot of ways. And that's what a lot of it's focused on. But you also saw these other things get incorporated into it over the course of that drafting. So I think the most interesting one is this, again, somewhat like random provision in there, which is about protecting workers from scheduling algorithms. If you use a scheduling algorithm or an algorithm to decide like worker pay, you need to protect the rights and interests of workers, and you need to sort of give them sufficient time and breaks and stuff like that. And that's another one where you can actually trace it back quite clearly to a viral magazine article that was called "Delivery Drivers Trapped in the System." It was in Dunhuang, which is like a Chinese magazine, non-state media. And it was this blockbuster
No,
article.
it is state media. It actually, it's like under the People's Daily, actually.
Oh, there you go. Very fun fact.
But no, I think it's an important point though, right? Because it's this is sort of like, people think of the system as a monolith, but on lots of different policy topics, there are ways in which individuals or like concerned people can sort of influence and educate the system, right? And, like a journalist and their editor at a state-owned media company decided that, raising the plight of temporary workers was sort of okay enough within the sort of like universe of things that you could talk about publicly, that it then, did the same thing that happens in news in the West, where there's like a big viral article, and then politicians are like, oh shit, we got to do something about it. And I think it's really important for folks to understand that dynamic, not on everything, but on certain topics, particularly when it comes to like technology and society, is a dynamic that can absolutely play out in China as well as in the West.
Yeah, absolutely. And like Renwu's at times it can be kind of an edgy newspaper. Like they published an interview with an early COVID doctor, maybe even not Li Wenliang, but an interview with I think a Wuhan doctor that was pretty critical of like COVID responses that eventually sort of got censored. So they have an ability to push the line a little bit. But I think, like you're saying, in this case, they were actually as much as the article is kind of calling out social problems and it's calling out tech companies, they did it in an environment where it was okay to do that. It's at a time when regulators are okay with state media sort of criticizing Chinese tech companies in a way that they might not have been comfortable with say 4 or 5 years earlier, when these were still maybe the darlings of the new economy under, Xi and Li Keqiang and stuff like that. So it happens within a policy environment that's sort of accepting of that type of criticism. And the journalists behind it, did a pretty amazing job with the article, but they were also building on the work of like a lot of Chinese academics. So these Chinese sociologists of labor who had been doing like deep research on the interface between algorithms and workers for years. And those Chinese sociologists are in turn kind of in conversation with US sociologists who write about algorithms and labor, and they're building on their work. So you see all these different kind of like intellectual strands that go into just that article. And when it sort of burst onto the scene, became super viral, it immediately led to some responses. So within, I think, a couple of days, CCTV was sort of airing segments in which the anchors were directly criticizing the platform companies and talking about how we had to increase regulation in this area. Eventually the State Administration of Market Regulation was like calling these companies in and kind of criticizing them and telling them they had to do better on this. And within a year, you see this worked first into kind of like a smaller regulatory document from State Administration of Market Regulation and CAC, and eventually it becomes a full provision within the recommendation algorithm regulation. And so we almost have, like, these are kind of two sides of the same, or opposite sides of the spectrum, in the sense that one is like core, party information control concern that starts with just a focus on recommendation algorithms. And you have these more sort of socially or intellectually driven contributions that do end up making their way into regulations just from a slightly different route. There are plenty more examples of this, like over the course of drafting, they also incorporated provisions about how you can't use your recommendation algorithms to reinforce monopolies, or you can't use it for excessive price discrimination. That's very much tied to like the sort of anti-monopoly concerns of the time rather than the original recommendation algorithm concerns. But it all, this all kind of gets turned into one sausage, which is the final regulation. And I think we can learn a lot from that.
Yeah, I mean, it's this fascinating interplay, and you set up this like mental model of the policy funnel of China's AI governance, and it's like, yeah, like you're not going to be writing an article talking about how China needs a color revolution, but if there is if something is bubbling up of like people being upset with technology, and someone writes one article and it isn't taken down, then the sort of window for all of these non-state or like state adjacent actors like Renwu, who, it's not the People's Daily, it's the Renmin Chuban She, the like People's Publishing House, which was like, founded by Mao. It's some state thing, whatever, we can dig into it later. Or like, the Tencent think tank that's like trying to add, do some like government relations thing to like screw over their competitors or whatever. Like there are so many policy topics in China which are not like, it's not like the state council is like the first and last word on, Xi Jinping in particular is not the first and last word on these sorts of things. And so, yeah, he'll like set the direction maybe, but it is much more emergent, like the policy creation process in China. It's not the same as the West, but it does have this sort of like similar emergent quality. And I think the sort of work that you're doing here on AI regulation is really important, both to sort of surface the specifics of what's happening in AI, but also illustrate for other folks thinking about lots of other different topics that, maybe military might be an exception, but like pretty much everything else that isn't like core national security stuff is going to have some of this really interesting sort of like public government back and forth and give and take, which I don't think the rest of the world pays enough attention to. And it's the sort of thing you really need to stare at if you actually want to understand how China works.
Yeah, I think like how much scope there is for that public input and public debate, and then also sort of how public that is as opposed to behind closed doors, obviously varies a lot by sort of issue area. So like you're saying, yeah, military issues, that's not really the realm of like online public discourse, and that's not going to be the primary driver of anything. But AI regulation, even though it's close to sort of AI development, which you could say is maybe a sensitive or a national geopolitical issue, the actual question of how do you regulate the technology is still a pretty sort of open debate over there. It's not seen as so overtly political that we kind of can't discuss it. they're very much like looking for good ideas in this area, and the government has to lean very heavily on both sort of like legal and policy academics, and also on sort of technical advisors for these sort of advisory committees that work with the CAC. And so you see this happen, like there's a little bit more space. There aren't these sort of entrenched interests. It's not like, Baidu has been like digging in and like, as a state-owned enterprise, it's been like digging trenches to like win this specific policy battle for 20 years. It's all happening very new, very quickly. And so I think there's just a lot more space right now for these kind of debates.
I will say, though, I think it was a few years ago, there was this debate in China around its relationship to North Korea. And it was like, I think David Owenby translated a lot of stuff on Reading the Chinese Dream, but you saw, and it's sort of like with something that's more sensitive, like you really need to be the right person to be able to express that opinion. So it's like the 72-year-old who like used to be in the ministry, or like the tenured beta professor who's like half retired or whatever. They're the ones who can write, the 5,000 word article saying like, the DPRK is a mess. Like, why are we friends with these guys anymore? Like, what are we even doing here? But you'd be surprised if you sort of know where to look, and, you sort of see the wind. Like, as soon as there's like a bit of a crack of a window open, and maybe that came from a, that didn't necessarily come from like a Xi public pronouncement, but maybe that was something that was like discussed as like, now we're going to have a little discussion about this, guys. And, the sort of, when it comes to those things, like there's signaling going on from Beijing to somewhere like Pyongyang saying like, look, we're comfortable exploring these other options. But it's just like the coolest. I just think like you learn the most about China when you sort of look at the opening and then the closing of these policy debates across a lot of different dimensions, because it really gives you like at least a window into how the system ultimately ends up deciding things. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to read like a reverse engineering of, China's DPRK policy, or a reverse engineering of their like Taiwan policy. Those are areas where I don't know where to look for the kind of influential voices. And a lot of what I was trying to do with this report was like figure out where to look, and then sort of give people a little bit of a shortcut so that they can follow along more easily.
As you were reading through all this stuff, Matt, were there any sort of any like new ideas that you just thought were like what was like surprising to you about these different thinkers or researchers?
I guess when the generative AI regulation when the draft debuted, I was pretty surprised at how public the debate was. That's not sort of a specific idea within it, but a lot of these people, they have, the influential people have private channels to do this stuff. They have, I think they usually call it Zhuanbao, like when you make a sort of a direct report within the system, not outside of the system. And I think that's oftentimes how much of this goes down. And I was kind of surprised in the generative AI one that even people who have all of those sort of private channels were actually airing their sort of thoughts in much more public forums. They were publishing articles saying like, hey, here's the 5 changes that we think need to be made to this regulation, and then sort of publishing that and debating it in public. So I think that the choice to channel some of that through the public sphere as opposed to purely through the private sphere was one thing that surprised me. I think I'd say somewhat continually impressed by how knowledgeable a lot of these Chinese academics or policy analysts are about what is going on in Europe and in the US. Like in some cases, I would get into conversations with these people, and they would ask something about the US, and it would just kind of become immediately clear to me that they knew far more about US AI policy than I did. And that attention to what's going on internationally, and then the ways that they will try to kind of localize those ideas for working within the Chinese context, I think is interesting. We see some of that in relation to the generative AI regulations, where I think they are looking at how the EU is going to deal with general purpose AI systems and trying to see if there's some sort of alignment there with tiered risk and all these different things. But yeah, I guess I'm kind of impressed by like the quality of Chinese scholarship in those areas, and how much more like internationally aware they are than sometimes we are, or I am.
all we have is Matt Sheehan and friends versus like entire, divisions of universities dedicated to analyzing American technology policy. It's maybe this is like the other lesson for the AI safety folks is like, if you build it in the US and the EU and the rest of the world, like that example will be very powerful for the sort of like Chinese, broader state policy ecosystem. If they see what America and the rest of the world is doing in AI, and the sort of restrictions that you put on from a safety, be that sort of societal or like AGI related risk perspective, that are still allowing these companies to like gain the, economic, technological benefits of it without necessarily sort of shutting everything down. If you can get that balance and then sort of have an example to then come back to the Chinese in 2027 and say, hey, look, like as long as you do this, that, and the other thing, and you can do it in a voluntary way, it doesn't have to be some like invasive international regulatory regime or whatever, but it'll work out for you guys. Here, look, it's working out for us. Like that is almost more powerful than, pushing Xi and Biden to sit down and like hash out some agreement.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky thing to talk about because in a lot of ways, like the US-China or the China sort of policy debate has swung very far to the side of like, look, China's going to do whatever it wants. Like we can't force them to do anything. They're never going to change, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't want to say like, we can push China to, or we can influence China by like telling them what to do. But there's tons and tons of sort of influence by osmosis or influence by, I don't want to say imitation, that maybe is a little bit too direct. It's not like they're trying to necessarily imitate all these things, but they're taking it on board. They're like looking at how this debate is playing out in other countries. They're drawing on ideas that they think are useful. And the more sort of mature and credible these debates or even these like policy interventions are in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere, the more likely that's going to be kind of brought on board by China, and not necessarily in the way where we tell them what to do, but in the case that they kind of feel that they are taking this idea on themselves and developing it and applying it in their own way.
I think you're right. You just took a trip to Beijing, Matt. I think you're my first guest who's gone there and back post COVID. What was it like?
It was great. I was so happy to be back. Thanks to Scott Kennedy and the good folks at CSIS for organizing this kind of track 2 dialogue of rebuilding scholarly exchange. So we got, from a work perspective, got to sit down and meet with a ton of great like Chinese scholars, sort of organizations around Beijing. From my own sort of work perspective, it was extremely well timed in that I landed there. I think 2 days later, this report came out. 2 days after that, the generative AI like final regulation dropped, and all through that time, I was able to sort of meet and have conversations with some of these Chinese AI policy scholars or regulatory scholars and get like very sort of firsthand takes on what they make of the regulation, what they make of this process, what I got right or wrong in the report. And so, yeah, it was just from a work perspective and from just like remembering that all these people, all these things that we read about, yeah, at the end of the day, they are people. They are people that in many ways like completely mirror us. The Chinese AI sort of policy scholars are often quite close mirrors of their sort of peers in the US, even if we conceive them to be enemies or rivals or something like that. So work stuff was great. And then just, from a personal level, the chance to be back in Beijing and just like breathe it in, see some friends, like walk the old neighborhoods. I mean, I really needed that, needed to just kind of like re-up on that life over there to remember why I do this work at all.
And I don't know how to make this point. It's like, if I was the Chinese government and I wanted to sort of like influence the next generation of, I don't know, global policymakers to like be less mean to China, what I would try to make sure that happens is that they have that same understanding that you do, of like that there are human beings who are in China, who are more similar than different than you. And like the state is not the party. Like China is not like the party, and that's it. And what is fascinating is how they don't get that, and they can't. It's like it's like that model of the world is just so foreign that like they can't orient their policymaking around that sort of thing. The damage that like the two Michaels and the sort of like random arrests of research assistants and what have you is just, it makes that so much harder for folks to sort of like fall into and have the understanding that, we've talked about over the past 5 minutes of like China being this, being more complex than just Xi Jinping. And of course there is Xi Jinping, and we've talked a lot about it on China Talk, and we will continue to. It's a really interesting conundrum how the sort of the dominant strategy for influencing the world, which is what America's done, of like giving everyone and their mother a Fulbright fellowship to come and spend 6 months here and like have a great time, is just not something that China, for all of its global ambitions, kind of does to some extent, I think, with the developing world, but can't quite grok with the developed world, I think, to its enormous detriment.
Yeah, I mean, in so many ways, they just like can't get out of their own way. You could trace it to a bunch of different kind of like, cultural mores or attitudes, or some very specific like Leninist approaches to things. But I guess, yeah, the bottom line is right now they are having an extremely hard time just kind of getting out of the way and allowing China to be like engaged with in a full sense. Obviously COVID clearly doesn't help with this. Like there have been some external factors that have like made all of these trends worse over time, but they're like sort of the government's unwillingness to allow for a type of engagement that will include some like downside risk. It will include some reports about Uyghur mass internment that you just you do not like as a country, you think are very damaging to you as a country, but you cannot have all of the other sort of stabilizing factors in the relationship without opening the door to some of that stuff. And their sort of unwillingness to tolerate that is really getting in the way of them sort of recovering their national image at a very large scale. And I think it's too bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it sort of comes from the elites down. Almost is like when you're not going to let New York Times reporters be in China to do reporting, like that limits the type of reporting that they're going to do. And you can't do a human interest story of like your old stories, Matt, of like the noodle maker just trying to get by or what have you, or the rise of Frisbee in China. Like that doesn't happen. And then so people sit in Washington and they write about US-China tech competition. And like, it's real. I spend most of my time thinking about that. But I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to be in China and get some sort of broader perspective on, the country and its relationships to the world. And the next generation may or may not have that, which is heartbreaking and dangerous not in ways that the CCP should like. If my reading of Xi Jinping thought is quite, is at all accurate. So anyways, it's a real bummer. I'm really glad you got to go. Seemed like a lot of fun. You've had some great photos.
Yeah, no, it was, it was great. I mean, I was there during like the 10 hottest days in Beijing history. So it was brutal in that sense. But yeah, I mean, the city, it's changed. It's the same, it feels way different. It feels just like old times, all that stuff. But it was, yeah, I was very lucky to get to go back, and I hope I get to go back more in the future.
Matt Sheehan, thanks so much for being part of China Talk.
上的屋顶也没生长天上的孤星。我说的一切是定数哈，所以我提前庆祝。大多数人会质疑我做到之前不幸福，他们对我吐唾沫，是嘲笑我落魄。就我自己在默默开悟，一切不戳破。小杂佬你们在哪儿哦？随便你我一笑而过，在你头顶无效而过，这是你耳膜。等老子走上去，你们咋个办？我早都预见未来，老子们不得甩塔罗牌撒撇。满身的力气带科技启动，头顶我历经，你看老迷宫，大部分的黎明必须要顶拢，必须顶满在你的领空。我又没屌你，哥们你后边还不翻篇。你是不负责，干那个又不干，听好了，云层上证明起响亮的雷声，雷声我将你的配成，拍掉我身上的这一身的几根灰尘，然后把他们都对准，说唱耍也比你得行，我是特你的德行，看到从低谷登顶，迎接新的生命降临。习惯了谷底渡劫，也习惯平常苦，不许理解，不走寻常路，做自己想做的，求一个问心无愧。如果我碌碌无为，手拿麦克风当我的墓碑。我不急等他们接受，我作品会成为杰作，一定顶端永不跌落，我的野心在你不灭的野火。妈妈说要加油，我爸说不能往下游，没给自己留退路，所以我更不能罢休。今天的感觉是前所，安全感即便我裸露，即便我录音棚依旧，即便我面前有万千，是对的。往上顶我的座右铭，往上顶天道酬勤，相信命运在我手心，滴滴几号铸就行。老子们天选，老子敢笃定，他们尖酸，他们是故意，人不如天算，他还是不行，风雷电闪，我扬眉吐气。看到你如是水手，看到我捡到最后，我在顶上俯视你对手。